We believe only innovation and partnerships can make sustainable agriculture a reality. We need to minimize our climate footprint. We need to reduce the impact of crop protection on the environment. And we must enable smallholders to boost local food production while we improve soil health and biodiversity around the globe. We need nothing less than to radically change how we grow and produce our food. We believe we can achieve better harvests while also producing more food with less land and fewer resources, helping to tackle climate change and feeding more people while protecting our planet. Join us in this journey and learn more about our initiatives and solutions. Together, we can shape the future of sustainable agriculture.
My name is Kees Huizinga. I'm a Dutch farmer and I've been farming in Ukraine for more than 20 years, or for nearly 20 years now. We're harvesting sunflowers at the moment, and they're driving past this field, up and down. Goes quite nice. Yields is around 3 tons per hectare, which is good for this year. This wheat field here behind me is for the world market. Ukraine only needs like 25-30% for itself, and the rest is for export. And when I was standing here in the spring, the wheat was also growing. And I was really worried about world food supply when Russia started the war on us on the 24th of February. And when I did some posts on Facebook and Twitter and through the Global Farmer Network, that Africa would really suffer from this, and that's happening. And besides the war issues or challenges, we also have normal agricultural challenges, when you start to appreciate them. But on top of the normal agricultural challenges, you also have kind of, the climate change, which is affecting us, and it makes it hard to predict things. But other disadvantages of climate change, you can't predict it, but you also can't predict your yields. And in a dry year, we have 4 or 5 tons of corn per hectare, for example. In a good year, we go 12, 13, 14 tons per hectare of corn. So how to prepare your soils, how much fertilizer to use, how much crop protection to use, how intensive do you want to grow. I think big companies, stock listed companies, they should focus on sustainable farming together with the farmers, and that means investing in technologies. It's either machinery technology or chemical technologies or crop technologies, like BT corn or GMO soybeans, which are not allowed here in Ukraine, for example, but they would fit greatly into our crop rotation. And governments should make things possible for this,
Good morning. Thanks a lot for joining us today here on this event. Appreciate your presence here. I hope that we can have a good dialogue today. This is all about a dialogue, is having that conversation. My name is Rodrigo Santos, as Christina presented me. It's great to be here representing my organization with my colleagues here at Bayer. This is what we do every day. We work in agriculture, we invest in agriculture. But before I start, let me once more say thanks to Mr. Olegs and his wife for having us here. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure, and I wish all the conversations about farming and ag would happen in farms. I may be suggest to Davos to happen here in the future, because that would be much more impactful if all the people that are talking about agriculture meet Mr. Olegs and the farmers and with them in the field. That makes a huge difference when you work. I was walking with Mr. Olegs this morning when we did a tour here in his farm. And Mr. Olegs, I remember my conversation with my father when I was walking with you. Because you mentioned some things that was very particular to me when I was back there in Brazil, walking with my father in the field. And it's amazing, you mentioned about what you learned from your father. It's a sixth generation of a farming here. And in the end of the day, for the next generations as well. For the farmers, one of the most important things is the soil. What are we going to see today here? How they manage the soils, because that will be generations after generations. The crops, they will live in the end of the season, but the soils will be here, and we're going to talk a little bit about that today. So it was a pleasure to be here having this short tour. So let me talk a little bit about what we're going to have. We're going to have a dialogue here, so I will be very short. I will not take a lot of your time here, because I want to hear also from the panel. Very excited, different views, wonderful experience to share here today. We have a challenge, and if I would just frame the challenge is what we heard from the farmer from Ukraine, and we work with the farmers this year in Ukraine. It's amazing. Amazing what they did in having the war there, how they managed their crops, how they really did another season was amazing to see, and we work with them every day there. It was an impressive challenge that I never seen in my life. But the war in Ukraine just brought additional challenge to the food security. And I think there was a wonderful debate now, more and more present in every conversation that we have about the importance of food security. How can we produce enough affordable, safe, health food for not only the 8 billion people that will be in November. Next month, we're going to have 8 billion people in this planet. But in the next decades, we're going to have 10 billion people in this planet. How are we going to produce enough food for that? Affordable one. At the same time, let me emphasize that, how are we going to mitigate the climate change? How are we going to help that one? The beauty is that what you're going to see today here in the field, what we're going to talk about agriculture is part of the solution for food security and for climate change. And it's all about sustainable agriculture, regenerative agriculture. This is the solution. When I walked here this morning, I remember that in the last 20 years, agriculture has changed dramatically. If you forecast for the next 10 years, will change again. And it will be important to have and to drive that change. So the first challenges. This year, 150 million people to hunger again. Not only we didn't improve, but we went backwards on the fight against hunger. That's quite unique. Last night I was watching the news in Africa about the drought in Africa and the impact of hunger again. So that's the first challenge. The second one, the climate change. How can we manage the two things? And I will share my perspective here. I have the privilege to travel around the world to talk with farmers like Mr. Olegs, but I had this year the opportunity to talk with the farmers in Africa, in India, in North America, in Latin America. And it's amazing the passion they share about what they do and how we can work with them to tackle these two challenges at the same time. And that is all about sustainable agriculture. We at Bayer, and I'm here representing the company, of course, we believe there is an importance behind that, is innovation, science, technology. Science and technology was extremely important to the place that we are today and will continue to be in the future. And when I talk about science and technology, I'm talking about different ways of that. Not one way, but all different ways. I'm talking about breeding. We're going to see hybrid wheat as an example. We're going to talk about the conventional breeding technologies, but we're going to talk also about gene editing. We're going to talk about biotechnology. We're going to talk about crop protection. We're going to talk about digital agriculture as a very important element, biologics. all these different technologies, and there is no one single solution. We don't see that. And farming, I heard from Mr. Olegs this morning, farming is changing every year. You have new pests, new pressures, so all the different tools are extremely relevant for that one. You heard from that farmer in Ukraine, and that's what I heard from the farmers in Africa this year. They need technology, they need innovation, they need things to help them to tackle the two issues that we were talking. And one of the key goals that we have at this company, when we invest close to 2 billion euros per year in R&D. We have 7,000 scientists working right now while we are here, developing new technologies for agriculture. That's what we do. That's our passion. We are all connected in this company, fighting every day to the challenge that we see with one single vision, that is hunger for none, health for all. That's our passion, and that's what we do. But let me stop here because I'm I know that you are very interested to see the debate here, the panelists. I again thank you everyone for coming here today, and all the ones that are also watching us live on the stream here. And again, finally, you're going to hear more from Mr. Olegs when we go for the tours and in the afternoon. But thank you very much. And with that, I will invite Tom to start our debate here. Thank you.
Thank you, Rodrigo. Thanks very much indeed, and welcome everybody. We will get started now with panel one of two panels that we'll have this morning. This one focused on fighting the current food crisis and strengthening food security. So as you've just heard from Rodrigo, obviously agriculture really having an important role to play here as being part of the solution and helping us tackle both those twin challenges of food security and climate change. So to speak to me on this panel, I'm honored to welcome the following guests. So first of all, I'd like to invite up onto the stage Sarah Menke, CEO and co-founder of Grow Intelligence. Frank Bagidi from the Eurasia Group, a source of intelligence in a complex world. Thank you, Frank. George Fernandez, who's joining us from the World Food Programme's Innovation Accelerator. And Rurumisu Mashumba, an award-winning farmer, CEO of Manandi, and chair of Zimbabwe Farmers Union Youth. So thanks all very much for joining me on the panel. We're going to talk through a couple of topics this morning. The balance between sort of the urgent measures and the need for sort of a more long-term thinking around developing further sustainability in agriculture. How we boost food production in the face of these climate challenges that we're facing, the harsh weather conditions that we see all over the world, and the importance in all of that of smallholder farmers and what they can do and how we can support them. So first of all, Sarah, let me turn to you. So thank you very much indeed for joining us. Grow Intelligence, a very interesting company, a company that brings together data insights and thinks around the world's ecology and how that links to financial markets, to the economy, to all sorts of aspects of our lives. Maybe you can help us here a little bit to kick us off. The insights that you're getting at the moment, the things that you're looking at Grow Intelligence, what's that telling us about the extent of the crisis that we are in, and what does it imply about how things are going to further develop?
All right. Well, thank you for having me here. I think let me maybe contextualize a little bit of where we are as a world today and sort of thinking about the crisis, which, you know, one of the things I always sort of say about sort of the Russia-Ukraine war is that it was adding fuel to an already burning fire. It didn't create the food crisis, it just made it much worse. So if you look at just a basket of food, so look at your major sort of grains, some vegetable oils and protein, and a basket globally, and you look at what price changes have how prices have changed around the world since the start of 2020. You're looking at, in the US, it's somewhere in the order of magnitude about 75%. Norway, it's 125%. Sudan, it's almost 2,000%. Syria, it's 700%. It's the first time where literally nobody is immune. And the combination, especially now, of essentially, like I said, some structural changes that started to occur in early 2020, but while we were in COVID lockdowns, combined with climate disruptions, combined with the Russia-Ukraine war, and now the strength of the dollar, have sort of put us in really sort of unprecedented times, right? So I think one is just the undoing of it will take time. There's, looking at things in short time frames of year to date, et cetera, I think is the wrong way to look at the current crisis, because then, it helps us understand it. So what changed? I think when you look at the supply side, we've just had a number of unprecedented supply side shocks, right? Whether it's extreme droughts in major growing regions like the US, Brazil, Argentina, etc., or on the flip side, disruptions on the flooding in places like Pakistan, right? So you sort of have extremities essentially sort of taking over in terms of the supply side on climate. And I think sort of just understanding and contextualizing climate disruptions is a key part of it. The second is if you had supply chain disruptions, that has just made the cost of operations significantly higher. Third, you have fertilizer and a fertilizer crisis, and the price of fertilizer has quadrupled essentially. So input costs for farmers have gone up, and that's 30 to 40% of your production costs. And I think that's actually one thing I'm worried about for next year and the year after, is really sort of an availability crisis, not even an affordability crisis, which is where we were this year on the fertilizer front. And then on the demand side, I think the really sort of big picture is that there was some big structural changes out of China. And that China became a structural importer of grain in 2020. So if you look at the numbers of a mix, again, people just overly focus on corn, but the feed mix in China is quite complex. So you just need to look at the full basket of grains. In 2020, China imported about 80% more grain than it did in 2019. Its baseline was low, but in 2021, despite lockdowns, it imported another 143% from 2020. This year, despite all the lockdowns and despite price increases, it's imported the same amount as it did last year. So that structural change in demand combined with supply side shocks, I think, is sort of what we're dealing with. So I just wanted to sort of maybe lay it out.
The great, fantastic empirical basis for our discussion, I think, today that you've just set out for us, Sarah. And I want to come back to you on some of the things that you maybe see as being potential ways to alleviate some of the challenges. But Frank, maybe I can ask you to kind of build on what Sarah's just shared with us. I mean, obviously, Eurasia Group has got kind of a broad global perspective on the dynamics and the forces that are happening in the world today. I mean, what is your organization's view about how this develops further? I mean, is the crisis in any way, do we see signs of it lessening? Do we see signs of it worsening? Where do you see it going from here?
That's a good question. Thanks, Tom. I think the main point here to understand, and I totally agree with what Sarah said, is that moving forward, what we're seeing is that the crisis might actually worsen. So people are experts, pundits, are actually more worried about 2023 than 2022 when it comes to food security. And I think that's maybe the part that we're missing in the conversation. And then the tension that we have is, how do we make sure that we lessen that impact? How do we make sure that that it becomes less disruptive across the world, whether it's in emerging markets or whether it's in industrialized markets. And bridging that gap will require efforts from various stakeholders in a way that we pretty much haven't seen before, and definitely not on the agricultural side. The tension here, I find, is that as we've experienced firsthand the direct impact of geopolitical tensions on food security, we would expect after this and after what we've seen in the past few months, a sort of massive support towards sustainable agricultural solutions, the same way that we saw on the energy side, right? So on the energy side, you saw the invasion of Ukraine that led to this massive, push towards more fossil fuel use temporarily. But in terms of the longer-term prospects, it's very clear that we are accelerating the decarbonization pathway and the renewable sources. We have not seen that same shift on the agricultural side. We haven't seen, actually, in terms of the numbers, the share of financial support towards sustainable agriculture solutions has declined since the beginning of the invasion of Ukraine. So the question then becomes, how do you mimic what we saw on the energy side towards agriculture? And the way to do it really is to reframe the conversation towards most of the food security aspect, the same way we're talking about energy now in terms of the energy security aspect. And that's how you bring in the sustainable agricultural element and component into it. And that means that you reframe your incentives, that when it comes to your interactions with farmers, you don't just focus on the sticks. In policy, we talk about carrot and sticks. You don't focus on the sticks, but you also focus on the carrot and making sure that they have more incentives to meet you where you want them to go in terms of sustainable agricultural practices. So it's a long kind kind of like a long road ahead. Unfortunately, the prospects are not that great, particularly when you think of international conferences like COP15, the Biodiversity Conference. We see that all of the targets that are related to agriculture are actually being revised down or being watered down and having a hard time to move forward in terms of the negotiations. So it will require massive efforts from policymakers, from private sector institutions, from farmers themselves, and we have yet to reach that level of consensus among different stakeholders, and we need to find ways to better collaborate together, hear each other out, so that we can frame those solutions for tomorrow.
Fantastic, thank you, Frank. So that idea of the partnership being very essential, but maybe I can kind of throw the question a bit to you, George, as well. I mean, thinking about it from the World Food Programme's perspective, this idea of a reframe, this idea of kind of thinking differently about the situation that we have around food security, food sovereignty, whatever the expression is that we use. How do you see that, and how do you see that specifically kind of maybe on the ground with some of the actions that your organization's driving?
No, I believe innovation and partnerships are key, particularly in the nexus between humanitarian aid and climate action towards food systems transformation. Because unfortunately, and I think Sarah alluded to it, we live in an unprecedented food crisis globally, right? It's never been this bad in many, many years, unfortunately. 1 in 10 people, or 828 million people, go to bed hungry every day, right? We have 345 million people that are suffering from acute food insecurity. 50 million people are actually, knocking on the door of starvation. This is a massive crisis that we hadn't seen in a long, long time, and it's a consequence of what we call the 4 Cs. It's climate change, it is the conflict, is COVID-19, and it's rising costs, which are really pushing us over the edge now. And we really need to come all together to make a dent at this and try to get ahead of the curve, because if this year is bad because of particularly inflation and the impact on pricing, next year will be even worse. It will be a combination of pricing and availability and shortage. We talked about fertilizers, we talked about many other things. So the question is, how do we work together with all agents in the ecosystem, including governments, including the farmers themselves, big and small, but we are particularly concerned with smallholder farmers in terms of bringing the solutions, not only for the production side, but also for the management and the prevention of food waste, right? Because that is an equal big challenge, and we can talk more about it, as it is on the production side. But definitely innovation and partnerships are key, and that's very much what we're focusing globally, but also at the national level.
Thank you, George. And I'd love to come back on some of the points that you just raised also around this kind of balance between the short and the long term, what we need to do for the next year or years, and then how we keep focused on our long-term goals. But maybe, Ramiso, to throw it over to you at this point in time. I mean, you obviously also have a very close to the ground connection with a network of farmers in the part of the world that you are from. Can you talk us through a little bit the greatest challenges that they face? I mean, what are some of the things that smallholder farmers maybe are talking to you about, the things that they see as being the big challenges and risks at the moment?
Oh, thank you so much. So myself, I'm a farmer, and I'm also working with women farmers. So I'll share what we experience. So right now, not only before COVID, we were already challenged with increased price pressure because of climate, increased droughts. Every year, the rain seasons are so unpredictable. So farming was already difficult. Then COVID happened. Now we have a whole disturbance in the supply chain. As farmers, we are price takers, so we don't determine how much we can sell our produce for. And fuel has doubled in Zimbabwe. There are no subsidies for fuel. Fertilizer is triple. And yet the price we sell to the market, it's still the same. So I would say we're seeing that we're pretty much just growing now just to hobby farm, but farmers are getting poorer and poorer, and you have no choice but to sell your produce because you don't have facilities to hold or to store. So when we look at what poverty looks like, it's getting worse. Unfortunately, before we were talking about 2030 goals and saying that we hope to become, better, but unfortunately, the way things are going, farming is getting more and more hard. And without proper interventions, without dialogue, there is going to be total disaster. So, many times farmers, when I'm talking, they ask, is there hope? Because how are we going to control, how are we supposed to produce with what we have? So we are always talking about we need better and more efficient systems in order for us to remain sustainable. Because farming as it is right now, it's really scary for a lot of people. And last season, when we sold our crops, in fact, beginning of this year, the price had already reduced because the market was trying to buy at the lowest and then sell at the highest price, and farmers had no choice. So I think the greatest challenge in sustainability is that farmers are always left behind. Sometimes you have these conversations, but farmers are hardly included. Nor is their voice, their challenge is ever thought of. Yeah. People always think of how can we safeguard ourselves before they think of the farmer. But the future would need a better sustainable method, because when we have all these farmers die of hunger, we shall not have the food on the plate.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Ramisu, for that very powerful perspective. I mean, maybe I can pick up the idea that you talked about interventions, you talked about more efficient systems, we also talked a little bit about sort of solutions generally. Maybe, what are the things that we're looking for in terms of the types of solutions, the types of things that can make a direct impact in the situation that we're in? George, do you want to pick that one up? Or?
No, absolutely. Some of these challenges are very recognizable, not only in Zimbabwe, but in a lot of the places where we operate. And first of all, it comes from the sheer understanding and the recognition that 35% of the global food supply is coming from smallholder farmers that are operating on 2 acres or less, right? And that is a massive amount if we think about it, but yet they are the least supported when it comes to information, knowledge, capability building, access to financing, access to insurance. So how can we actually create innovative solutions that are suitable to also their circumstances, the price points that they can afford and things like that. So we're very actively working with innovators across the globe to do exactly that. How can we attract them and support them in validating, but also adjusting their innovations towards that, being that with startups like Arable that has a data management system targeting smallholder farmers, be it that with microinsurance companies, S4S, be it with processing technology that allows for these post-harvest management, because we see a lot, up to a third of the global food supply is actually wasted, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, where, let's say, the infrastructure is not there. So working on things as simple as a hermetic bag or warehousing capacity, but also processing the crops, shortly after harvesting, so that more of the value stays with the farmers. These are difficult examples that we can, jointly bring about to actually make sure that they earn a fairer share of the value that they produce, and actually allows them to actually graduate out of poverty, because very often they are just there on subsistence level. That's why we help them also in many other ways, even financially, but hopefully they can also cater for themselves and be part of the solution that we want for the future.
Great. I'm going to turn and take some questions from the room or online in 1 minute, but maybe I can also just ask you, Sarah, as well, for your perspective on solutions. So we obviously had one very kind of a concrete perspective there from George. I mean, I think when you were talking, you were also thinking more broadly around, partnerships, for example, different ways of approaching the crisis that we're in. I mean, is there maybe something that you can add there in terms of the types of approaches that we should be pursuing, you think?
Yeah, I mean, I will say one of the things that has been most shocking to me, and maybe it shouldn't have been, but it was, is just how much educating we've had to do in sort of the past 6 months to the world about our global food systems and food security, including our world leaders who haven't paid attention to it. So when we talk about sort of solutions and we talk about partnerships, part of what my role has literally been just being an educator. Like, fact-based education around where do we stand, where are we coming from? Because ultimately the scale of the challenge can't be tackled by a few. It needs real collective action, and it needs a lot of money. And that's not going to come unless the people who control the money are paying attention to these problems, right? It also requires collaboration across industries in a way that I think we haven't done before. So, for example, I say energy security is food security is energy security, and we're not doing both well right now, right? And the lack of communication and dialogue between the energy industry and the food industry was shocking to me. I was a former energy trader, so we speak both languages, and so even serving as a translator in those two worlds has sort of been a way of sort of moving things effectively. But I think that ultimately to fund these challenges at scale, we also need sort of the capital markets to step up in a way that they haven't before. So the example I give is when I was an oil and gas trader, which I was, when a producer came and said, I want to sell oil 2 to 3 years forward, when I started, that was really difficult. When I left, we were buying oil and gas 20 years forward. What did that do? That funded a new wave of innovation in even the conventional energy markets that drove down the cost of things like natural gas, which displaced coal. Still not there, but like the move to renewables really has been a long journey, but it's been an expensive one.
Right.
And many, many players around sort of the capital markets stepped up to do that. We need that level of education and that level of up-leveling on sort of the global system as a whole to fund innovation, because this is going to be really expensive change, and it's not funding it day to day or year to year. We have to start funding it a decade at a time.
Right.
And, we're still at 2 years forward in U.S. corn. So we have a ways to go. There's hope. But I just think it's like real structural change that needs.
Sure, but that's a great point of view, the long-term perspective on innovation. I mean, obviously, innovation in our industry also takes a long time. The cycles are long, but that sense of a transition, the recognition that these things take time, I think is important. Maybe Frank, I can invite you to join in that conversation. Just something you said earlier on reminded me a little bit of this tension between the kind of the short term and the long term, right? I mean, it's I think sometimes hard to get the balance right. What do you think are some of the factors that help us to, continue on this long-term sustainable transformation of agriculture, whilst also tackling some of the short-term issues that we have?
Well, and building on Sarah's point, because it's exactly where we are today, the issue remains funding. The issue remains the financial support that you have behind those solutions. They won't happen overnight without that type of structural, massive capital investment. And that oftentimes comes from policy, right? If we're talking about ending harmful agricultural subsidies, that comes from the regulatory perspective. And then that will hopefully then trickle down on the financial markets. What we're seeing right now is that transition is not happening at the moment. Last year, over 100 countries committed to transform their national food plans. What is happening? What is the update? Do we have some sort of implementation mechanism moving forward? There's nothing that's being said on this topic as we're going through a massive crisis. So the question then becomes, are we taking this crisis as an opportunity to maybe look further and try to correct and right the wrongs that we've been doing in the past? And I go back to Sarah's initial point on the education and raising awareness. We talk sometimes to some MPs, and I had this conversation earlier before the panel, to some MPs who would tell you, I've never been to a farm in my life. So, okay, so you've never been to a farm, but you are designing very plans that are going to affect all farmers moving forward. So those are the type of kind of like tensions and bridge that we need to reconcile moving forward. So that means you end harmful agricultural subsidies, you try to do it at the global or the national level, and then you need to ensure that it trickles down at the local level. What we see a lot of time when it comes to the solution is that we tend to forget that agriculture doesn't operate in a vacuum. It operates with specific cultural norms and specific kind of like historical practices. So how do you make sure that when you devise those plans, when you unlock that funding, it then translates into practices that can actually stand the test of time? That is another challenge that we're having at the moment. And then when you really kind of like close the loop, I think that we need to, and you see it oftentimes with the assistance programs that are coming up. It's not just about having dedicated incentives, right? It's also about once you have those incentives, how do you follow up on those? Or how do you make sure that they go all the way where they need to be? So let me give you a concrete example. When we provide training, right? Like you say, you take an international organization that provides training to farmers. That's one step. But are you just going to provide free training, or are you going to pay them as you provide that training? Because they're taking time out of their day when they're already making very small margin, as you said, to do that training for you. So it's also like thinking about it through an entrepreneurial lens, through kind of like a private sector lens, that will then help us reach the outcomes that we've been looking for.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you, Frank, for that perspective. I'm just going to look around the room and see if there is a question from the audience here. If not, I have questions from the chat. In fact, one relevant question, maybe Ruramisu, I can take you into this one. So thinking about smallholders, thinking about their very important role in the topic of food security, can you help us understand a little bit how, for example, the topic of digitalization might be relevant there, and can it kind of play a greater role in this crisis situation that we find ourselves in than perhaps previously thought? You know, what are the applications? What are some of the potential ways that could accelerate the transformation of the sector?
Definitely digitalization has a role to play for farmers, but over the years, I've had lots of organization work on developing sort of platforms that farmers can use. But it's always good to consider the level of education the farmer is at before developing. Like mentioned earlier, that sometimes these things are developed by someone who has never been on the ground or understands the lack of education that some of the farmers might have. Right. Not all, but you'll find that some of the farmers that I work with, when we do trainings, we sometimes invite guest speakers who might speak in English and they hear absolutely nothing. So you need to consider, is the language that I developed this, can it be translated to the local language? Because it can be developed and no one can hear it. That's one. Then there's the accessibility of the internet in those rural areas. Do they have is there an off internet platform that can be developed so that they don't necessarily have to be connected, because we do not have fast internet like you have here. Our internet is slow and very expensive and unaffordable for some in the rural areas, and also the type of phones they have. So, and also the complexity. Like sometimes I've had so many times that I've had people who come and speak to my community. They speak such high-tech language that you assume that maybe they have had some education in. But a lot of the women who we work with, they actually never even attended 3 years of school. So they don't know the language of farming. They know the farming, but they just don't know what you mean when you say a certain terminology. So it's very important to really realize who are you developing this for, because there are, of course, medium capacity farmers, commercial farmers. So if you're going to develop for the very marginalized, go to the community, spend some time or gather information and really find out, and then also understand what is it they're struggling with. There's some things like understanding the climate, understanding conservation agriculture. Those things our farmers really desperately need, and they can't find the information. So there's so much digitalization can do, but it needs to be correctly designed, or else it will have no impact.
Right, and put in the right context, and obviously there's some fundamentals there by the sound of it as well that need to be addressed through education.
Yes.
Beyond digitalization, maybe there are other technologies or there are other innovations that you would hope to see coming to smallholder farmers that could make a transformational difference, you think?
Yes, lots of technology. I think technology is the future. It's not working fast enough. Many people are developing stuff that we cannot find or access. You only hear it on some international platforms, but you never know where to even find it. So, even like access to finance, I think that we need to relook at how is financing, because, when lots of the smallholders, we're depending on our financing model for our banks. Our banks are giving us a 20-30%, and they want their money in 3 months. That's just the way it is in Zimbabwe, and there's no way. But I think that there can be other platforms that can be designed where you can actually find other ways of borrowing money, and people just don't want a lot of money. They want to borrow $500 so that they can start their small project. So there needs to be other innovative methods where people can borrow and then they can return the money at a reasonable rate, and also consider the time that it takes for me to plant, to first procure the crop, the inputs, plant, take to market, get my money, and then pay back. Be considerate of that time. So I think there is a need for developing of proper financial models. There needs to be development of access to the inputs. Inputs, we talk about them like they're easy to find. I can tell you that they're not always easy. No, our good variety is easy to know. No information on that variety, how to grow it, when to grow it. That information is just not found at times. Access to the correct technology. In Africa sometimes, or even in Zimbabwe, we don't know, we can't access the correct equipment. We don't know where to find it. We don't know which is the best. So there's so much like gap from the real us on the ground and other people who are doing all these fantastic things, we just can't find each other. Until we find each other, then maybe we can start solving some of these solutions.
Yeah, thank you, Ramiso. So, George, I mean, maybe also you can help me answer one of the questions from the chat here as well, in building a little bit perhaps on what Ramiso talked about. Is the question is, how do you promote agricultural literacy in African young farmers looking at technology and finance? I mean, maybe one for both of you there, but I saw you wanting to respond a little bit to what Ramiso said.
No, we are present in 120 countries, but we work a lot with local organizations and NGOs that know the context, know the people, speak the language, which is very important in order to be, successful in these interventions. And we always try to localize whatever idea we have. And these 2 points that you mentioned are absolutely key: access to information, access to technology, but also access to finance that is affordable, right? Microfinance tends to be prohibitively expensive in most parts of the world, if provided at all, right? We're working on this particular project, which we call She Can, because we also wanted to make it about women economic empowerment and financial inclusion, which is exactly about that, which is providing access to microfinance that is ethical, collateral-free, affordable interest rates, and not so much creating an over-indebtedness spiral that very often happens with microfinance. And we do that by working a lot with what we call village savings and lending groups, that the community helps each other. First of all, building that capability, that information, that literacy, and that there's also this peer-to-peer support that is very strong in these communities, that one helps thy neighbor. And this is allowing us to reach, several thousand people this year in Peru, Zambia, Rwanda, on the way to going to Malawi and Nigeria, a few other countries, exactly to promote that there is a transformation around the microfinance landscape that do come and serve these people. But microfinance is one example. Microinsurance is another one, because people also need their safety nets. Things that we take for granted are often not even available to these communities, right? And the rest is access to data and information, right? Knowing which crops, knowing where to get the right inputs, access to fertilizer, access to low-tech technology that can be operated by people that have different degrees of literacy level. So basically customizing things to the reality of the smallholder farmers that we are working with, while working as well with local governments and other parties in the national level to provide the right context, right advocacy, but also the right incentives, so that we promote this change that we see happening. And we see promising signs, but there's so much more to do, because the need is so great. Yeah.
Yeah. And maybe I can ask for a question in the room. So there's a question here, if somebody has a microphone. Here it comes. Galloping through the room here, thank you.
Thanks. I'm Olaf Staubeck from the Financial Times. I have a question to Romariso. What's in Zimbabwe and your personally, what's your view on these kind of multinational giants like Bayer? Do you see them? Do you perceive them as a kind of sort of good, providing innovative product, or is it kind of more an engine, kind of a company or companies which kind of increase their profit at the moment, increase profit margins, and kind of capitalize on these food shortages? Thanks.
Okay, thank you for that. Well, I see the role of companies to really support everyone that they are producing product for. So my thoughts would be that a lot of these organizations understand that they do need the farmers. It's difficult to make profit without any of the farmers. So they do need to ensure that the farmers are also trained. They have access to the correct tools for them. I think that's why sometimes you have these dialogues, so that they can understand the exact need of the farmer in our different climatics, our different environment. So I'm hopeful, and I see that there's a lot of work that's being done, because maybe many years ago, farmers hardly used to give their voices, but there's been this urgency, especially when we're working with organizations like the FAO, which have really brought farmers on the platform and connected us to organizations that maybe we would not know of or speak to share our needs with the organizations, so that they can better develop material and solutions for us. So I think it's about building the relationship, and it takes time. And over time, we should build relationships where we can be supported, because we do need the organizations to correctly develop things that affect us. I hope I answered your question.
Invite others to share a perspective on that, but also maybe kind of related to the question that Mr. Storbeck asked. What more should companies be doing, frankly, to help in the situation of trying to secure food supply? Sarah, please.
Get on.
Sorry, I was looking at you, but didn't say.
No, I think one of the things that actually sort of starting the company 8 years ago, one of the hard things about being a data company was that we started a company in an industry that's actually largely been built on too much mistrust of one another, right? So trust was sort of fundamentally broken, and I didn't fully recognize it because I noticed it when we'd go to hedge funds who buy our data, and they'd be like, well, you publish a lot of stuff for free. Am I going to find enough signals in this to make money off the trading? And then we would go to sort of public institutions, and they say, well, you sell to evil hedge funds and big companies, and how can we trust you if, how can you actually care? And it was always this dichotomy of an either or, and we had to pick a side. And I used to say, and I still believe that data, information, knowledge is a bridge to understanding and to building trust. And I think we've crossed that that barrier now where we do develop public goods as a private company, but we don't, and we serve large companies. But what that has also done is create the bridge and understanding of sort of a dialogue to start to occur at a level that I don't think used to happen before. There's still a long way to go, but I do think we need to in our food systems, reframe this narrative that we've sort of built in our heads of it's an either or and it's sort of a David and Goliath, etc., because we sort of all need to sort of survive together, and there's a famous quote that says, eating is an agricultural act, and I rewrote it to say living is an agricultural act, in the sense that from the moment we wake up, everything we interact with has some type of agricultural component to it, and we don't recognize it as humanity. And so I think that sort of reframing that sort of dialogue, but also sort of building trust is such an important component of this journey.
Yeah, absolutely. George, I saw you nodding now.
We need everyone, right? The challenge is so great that we need both the public and the private sector to come together and really forge that partnership in order to tackle the issue. Let me put it in perspective. We have plans this year for a total budget of 24.5 billion to reach 153 million people. We are close at 9.5 billion year to date. That sounds a lot, but that means there are people in the ground that are deciding who gets help and who does not, right? So how can private sector companies, large companies contribute, both through funding, but also their capabilities, right? Making their technologies affordable to the people that need it the most, which are the ones that organizations like ours are trying to help. There's so much that private sector can contribute, both large and small companies, but especially the multinationals that have the capabilities and the presence on the ground in the place that we are to actually make a contribution through their science, their offerings, but also making their knowledge, their capabilities accessible to those people that can actually benefit the most. And as that, make a step up towards getting out of aid and maybe being able to cater for themselves, being more resilient as a community. I think there's a lot of opportunity that we can tackle. Also because it is a necessity. We really need to act now, otherwise, like I said before, we're going to have an even greater crisis in the years ahead, where we will have more famine, more migrations, more potentially conflict in the back of this. So the time to act is now.
Great, thank you, George. So we've touched on this, I think, in several ways, but Frank, I just want to ask you to help us kind of answer this question from the chat. What's the best way to connect top-down global and bottom-up local measures to transform food systems to strengthen food security? Do you have a perspective there on what the best, most effective manner is that we can kind of bring these two pieces of the puzzle together?
Yeah, no, and I do agree. I like how the question is framed, because it's both, right? Like it's top down, but it's also bottom up. So you need to have the two perspectives at the same time. I'm a firm believer in global framework because I do believe that they give everyone some sort of a roadmap, right? Like, or at least we're all moving in the same direction. So having that sort of like, clear trajectory, whether it's a 2030 outlook or a 2050 outlook, it helps everyone move in the same direction. Then you need to make sure that it trickles down further, and then you need to also make sure that there are some sort of monitoring, or implementation mechanism that allow you to track progress over time and everywhere. I think the issue, particularly when it comes to agriculture or with the topic that I cover for Eurasia Group, which is biodiversity, and oftentimes both are, in the same conversation, is that it's extremely local. So it's like, how do you end up having a global framework for a topic that ends up being extremely local, with different localized impact from one place to another, sometimes even within the same region or sub-region or within the same country. And that requires even more efforts and even more cooperation and even more discussions. And so I think that means that when you draft those global framework, you have to have some sort of space and flexibility to ensure that you can have exemptions or that you can have, differentiated targets for specific country and so on and so forth. So when you talk about sustainable agricultural practices and you talk about scaling them up further, we have to have some sort of understanding that the pace with which it's going to go in Europe or in North America is going to be different than Sub-Saharan Africa, for instance, or than Latin America. And then when you take it to that step, you have to realize, okay, then what's missing in those regions for them to get to the next level? And oftentimes that's funding. So then it becomes the question of where is that funding? Where does the financing come from? And obviously it has to be some sort of, global North versus global South cooperation. And we don't see that happening right now. So you cannot have those expectations without having the funding, and you cannot have those expectations without having some sort of trickle-down conversation from the top level to then the local level. Unfortunately, that hasn't happened yet. I do think that things are slowly but surely moving in the right direction because we're seeing the parallel conversations happening. At the EU side, you have the Farm to Fork strategy that is moving forward. You have the nature restoration law that has been proposed in June to reach full nature restoration by 2050. So you kind of like see those regional building blocks coming up. So the US, the IRA bill is dedicating $20 billion to climate-smart agriculture. So things are kind of like moving forward in that sense. But then you also have to look at how does that, takes place locally, and that means more collaboration with different countries. That means more collaboration with different farmer associations. That means more collaboration with different industry lobbies, and obviously, particularly in countries where government's funding are quite limited because of the multiple crises that are happening at the same time, that means the private sector stepping in and big companies also playing their role. The last point that I would like to add on this is that we need to hold each actor accountable for what they're actually responsible for. And I find that sometimes the conversation tends to move a little bit, beyond that spectrum. Take the case of fertilizer companies, right? Oftentimes, when I hear the criticism or the backlash against fertilizer company, it's about the excess use of their product. But in reality, one could wonder, does it have really anything to do with them and with the work that they do? And we don't then move the conversation to how they could have more sustainable practice when it comes to phosphorus mining, or when it comes to ammonia production or potassium production, or when it comes to their warehouse or in-country distribution, so across the supply chain. So having those really segmented conversations as to what it is that you are supposed to do and how can you do it and are you doing it well, I think is going to be also another step in the right direction.
That's great. Thanks, Frank, for that perspective too. And I'm going to pick that up and maybe move us towards a little bit slowly towards the conclusion with a final question. But before we get there, you mentioned, Sarah, sort of logistics and the entire sort of supply chain equation here. And this is maybe one area that we've not touched on too much. We've talked about technology, we've talked about digitalization, the need for innovation, the need for partnership. But this idea of logistics as being, a fundamental part of this puzzle as well. Question here from the chat. How can we drive more local production, especially in regions affected by climate change? How can we make this more economically viable for farmers? I don't know whether from a markets perspective, Sarah, or George, or Amisu, from your experiences on the ground, whether you have points of view on that.
Economic viability. Like, how do you solve climate change? Listen, I think economic viability goes to sort of the financing models conversation, right, whether it's sort of from a lending standpoint or an insurability standpoint, right? I mean, I think one of the things that is going to be critical for our food systems is actually rethinking insurance. I think we have to completely rethink insurance. And really, this applies well beyond sort of agriculture, because again, insurance affects not just the production side of things, but the logistics side. So,
Right.
look at what's happening in the Mississippi River right now. Crops are being grown in the U.S. You can't get them out because the water levels are too low. That itself is a climate-related sort of disruption. And so much of sort of what we've left in terms of how we do insurance actually in sort of agriculture has been left to a few institutions
Right.
that essentially are warehousing all the risk, that will not be able to warehouse that one-way risk for much longer at the scale that will need to sort of be funded and sort of financed, right? So I think, if you look at Odessa and sort of the impact that just the shutting down of Odessa had on global food markets, if you look at the 124 cities and towns that span the Mississippi River, those cities and towns are responsible for 40% of global commodity flows.
Yeah.
40%. So there are places that are incredibly vulnerable and incredibly large, and just we are not thinking about it. So when I think of economic viability, you have to think about economic viability across the stream. So whether it's thinking of lending schemes and what makes that work in sub-Saharan Africa, which is very different than the Mississippi River, but essentially you have to think of it as a global portfolio that needs risk management on a very different level.
Yeah. Makes good sense, George. No, addressing the food supply chain issue is a big part of the solution, and that can come both from global supply chains, and you mentioned Odessa, and WFP has been working very actively on the ground to facilitate the outflows of grain out of Ukraine, and luckily we see that happening now, and that is reducing some pressure on price points, but especially making it more available to the communities that need it the most. But we also see it at local levels, where smallholder farmers get the least share of the value they create just because they don't have the access to markets directly. There's too many intermediaries, and we need to rethink those models so that they also are equipped with the type of post-harvest management technologies that allow them to actually preserve and not have to sell immediate upon harvest just because they're afraid of any kind of losses there with pests and mold and things like that. So how can we disintermediate these supply chains, making the farmers having more access to the end markets and facilitating that? We ourselves are trying to do that with our own purchasing of local food supplies. We purchase from smallholder farmers in 40 countries on an annual basis, and we're trying to increase that as more and more so that we actually make that most of the value goes to them. But ultimately, it has to come down to facilitate access to markets, creating more awareness about the importance of post-harvest management, and also the importance of insurance, that they are protected if the unfortunate weather or other event happens, which tends to happen a lot. Yeah. Appreciate it. Thanks, George. So Ruamisu, I'm gonna come to you for a final, first in 4 final questions. I'm gonna ask the same thing to all 4 of you, maybe a bit of a quick fire round here to close us out. But as you think forward to 2023, we've talked a lot about the challenges that we've been having in 2022, seeing across the food production sector. What do you see as the biggest risk and the biggest opportunity in 23 from your perspective? The others get a head start because they get a chance to have a think while you answer this one.
Okay, actually I wanted to add...
Oh, please, yes. Go ahead, yes.
Oh, well, I also wanted to add just on the true cost of food. I think something that people forget, because a lot of the times there's this pressure to say food should be very cheap. But if we're going to think about it, what is the true cost and who's going to pay? Because for so long, we've just said the farmer should pay to allow food to be affordable. But what is the true cost? And I think even just to add on to your next question, I think 2023 we need to really look at this and say, what is the true cost of food? Who pays? If we still, and looking at sustainability having also a cost, who pays? So I think those are something that I'm really trying to puzzle in my head to say, as much as we want farmers to contribute in protecting our earth, our soil, but who pays for that? Is it always going to be the farmer who pays?
Thank you, Ruamisu. The great closing comments from you. Thank you, George. Turning to you next. Risks and opportunities 23.
I think the risk is the increased price pressure that we see across the globe, and also the availability If you add to that that basically we are wasting $1 trillion in value in food going to waste every year, that gives you, let's say, a sense for the magnitude of the problem. So I would say we need to focus on climate action in terms of mitigating and adapting towards the reality that we have, which is more droughts, more unstable weather events that are difficult to predict. So how do we provide education, information, technology, and finance to the farmers that need the most, but also making sure that we don't waste, all of us, but also especially very often starting from the farm upwards, the food that is produced globally.
Thanks, George. Frank?
Yeah, I mean, I think that our biggest risk is also our biggest opportunity, which is really this crisis, right? Yeah. So it then becomes up to us to figure out, what are we making with this, and are we making the most out of it, and are we coming up with solutions that are intrinsically fair? And I think we're not there yet. I go back to my point on differentiated impact. You mentioned earlier that 35% of food production is coming from smallholder farmers. That leaves a huge chunk that is not from smallholder farmers. So maybe when we design those solutions or when we have those targets, maybe we're a bit tougher on the ones that are not the smallholder farmers, and then we expect a bit more from them than from the others. So those are the type of kind of, I guess, targeted frameworks that I expect to come out of this crisis, should we use it the right way.
Great, thank you, Frank. And finally, Sarah.
Biggest risk on the sort of agricultural side to me is fertilizer right now. Going into sort of the winter where natural gas prices and natural gas is used for heating our homes. That's what we need for producing fertilizer, and Europe is very short fertilizer. We did an analysis this summer where we partnered with the International Fertilizer Association, took anonymized data on sort of different scenarios they had for under different sort of how how the war was going to play out and availability was about to play out. We had a base case, an optimistic case, and a pessimistic case. And looking at sort of nitrogen response rates and around the world and application rates around the world, basically saying under these 3 different scenarios, what are we looking at in terms of production and a hit on productivity, especially with regards to nitrogen. And, the pessimistic case, we're now worse than the pessimistic case scenario. Those scenarios are being updated, right? But when we did that analysis and we open sourced it, so we partnered with the Gates Foundation, and this is a perfect example of private industry, public sector coming together, developing a tool for sort of the world to understand. And that was going to lead to a reduction of sort of food supply for about 200 million people. That was the pessimistic case scenario. I really, really worry that going into sort of the winter, we basically have a potash problem, a phosphate problem, and a nitrogen problem. And we've just never had that at that scale. And so from a risk standpoint, I am truly, truly worried about sort of production, productivity, et cetera, into 2023, 2024, and what regions in the world get hit by that. Places like the US and Brazil will be fine. But places like Sub-Saharan Africa, where yields are already low, application rates were already low. When you go from already low to zero, which is where we're headed, that's what that actually means for the crisis is really sort of worrisome. I think from an opportunity standpoint, I'm generally a very optimistic person. It's been hard to be optimistic recently, but from an opportunity standpoint, I really do think that food, agriculture, food systems, et cetera, are now top of mind for every world leader for the first time. I mean, it's taken too long, but the same people who make the decisions on sort of what weapons to buy are the same people now focused on food systems. And I think we use this as sort of an opportunity to make sure that some of the changes and the attention that's being focused is also driven towards long-term changes so that we're not back in this position again, a decade from now. Because 07, 08, there was a lot of movement and a lot of promises made around never again, we'll look around the corner, we won't be surprised. And then, we found ourselves here. So just keeping it top of mind for folks.
Fantastic. Okay, well, Sarah, thank you for those closing words, and thank you, all of you, for your time. I appreciate it's extremely busy time of year with many conversations happening around this topic all over the world, and more to come this week. So thanks for taking the time out and coming to join us here in Romerskirchen. We appreciate it, and I'd ask you all to give a round of applause, please, to our panelists. Thank you, Sarah, Frank, George, Yurumisa. Thank you. Okay. Then we'll take a short break. Thank you. Hey. Okay, so I'd like to ask you to return to your seats. We'll keep going with the second panel. After our first conversation, the second panel, we're going to talk more about the shift towards more sustainable agriculture. In the first panel, we talked about this big picture, the societal perspective of the challenges we face, and we looked in particular at the role of the smallholder farmer and how they are impacted and have the potential to transform. So we have got an opportunity now to talk about all farmers and the transformation that they can make towards a more sustainable form of agriculture, including this farm here that we're on in Romerskirchen in Germany. So I'm just asking my colleagues to join me here on the panel, and I will introduce them as they come up. So Ariana Julia Dori, Secretary General of the World Farmers Organization. Thank you for joining us, Ariana. We have Dr. Urs Nigli, who's a leading thinker on modern farming and organic agriculture. We've got Yvonne Kolomer, Director of the Triptolemos Foundation, focused on sustainable food systems, and Frank Terhorst, my colleague and Head of Sustainability and Strategy at Bayer Crop Science. So in this second panel, we're going to be talking about various subjects, I hope, the decarbonization of agriculture, how we continue to reduce the environmental impact of agriculture, how we digitalize, how we transform agriculture through digital tools, and how we collaborate to drive forward a more sustainable vision for farming. So then we will get started right away with Urs. Perhaps you can help us, Urs, bring us into the conversation here with a sense of how farming can continue on its journey towards the reduction of the impact that it has on the environment. I know this is a topic that you've spent a lot of time writing and thinking and speaking about, and helping various organizations to think through. Fundamentally, we're dealing with a very complex system, right? I mean, we've talked about smallholder farmers. We're here on a mid-sized European farm. Farms are very different all over the world. How do you start tackling that complexity, and how can we start approaching a more sustainable vision for agriculture despite that complexity? Urs?
Yeah, thanks a lot, Tom. I think it's clear, and in the scientific community, everybody knows it, that we have to reduce the impact of farming on the environment. We have to reduce the negative impact on soil fertility. We have to build up soil fertility. We have to regain more biodiversity in the field, but also around the fields and in the entire landscape. We have to diversify again our landscape. And for instance, looking at the recommendation of the scientific group of the National Action Plan National Pesticide Action Plan of the German government, we produced a report that nitrogen, nitrate, and also pesticides are the most important causes of biodiversity losses in our agricultural ecosystems. And so there is a need for action. And of course, there is always a trade-off with productivity. And so this trade-off will become much more severe in the next future. We see many opportunities. Basically, we know how to change, how to transform farms and farming systems. And you might notice that I had worked for a long time, more than 30 years, to further develop organic farming, because when I was young, my vision was that organic farming could be the pathway towards a productive sustainability, not an unproductive, a productive sustainability. Doing research with more than 300 scientists on improving this farming system, I realized that maybe we have to expand a little bit our understanding, and we shouldn't work in such a codified way as organic farming does. But basically, organic farming offers already many solutions, and we have to discuss now which could be added to organic farming in order to become more productive while maintaining ecological and social sustainability.
Yeah, and that's a great jumping off point that we'll come back to later, Urs. I think this idea of, what are some of the trade-offs, but also what is that broader definition, and how will that help us to tackle some of the challenges we talked about in the first panel. Ariana, maybe I can turn to you, thinking about the World Farmers Organization, and thinking about some of what we discussed also in the first panel around what are the tools, what are some of the solutions and the technologies that farmers ultimately need, from your perspective, to actually overcome some of the challenges that we've been discussing today: food security, climate change. What are the things that farmers are looking for in order to help them overcome those challenges?
First of all, thanks for inviting me. I'm particularly inspired by the previous panel, and the first element I would like to share with all of you is that actually it's not one challenge. These are multiple challenges, as you were saying. I would for sure put first food security. We must really feed these 8-10 billion people. It's about climate. It's about biodiversity and nature as a whole. It's about the quality of the nutrition. Farmers are not forgetting nutrition is also one of the elements of this equation. But then at the end of the day, when a farmer makes his or her choice on the farm, is one choice that must fit with all of these challenges at the same time. And I would like to call on all of you to realize how complex and how much pressure is upon the farmer's shoulders when tackling, through one choice, one decision on the farm, all of the challenges the humankind is facing right now on Earth. So, to your question, I think we don't need one solution, we need multiple solutions, and we need to make sure that we provide the farmers with the widest possible toolbox where they are going to pick the solution that is the most adapted to their own reality. And to do that, I think we should reverse the paradigm and stop talking about what the farmers need or the fact that we know what is needed, we know how to go to them and tell them, you should do this, you should do that. We must really embrace the farmers as actors and players sitting at the table together with research, which is fundamental, with the value chain actors, with civil society and governments, designing strategies that are best fitting to their needs and expectations.
Thank you very much indeed, Ariana, for those opening thoughts. It's a great perspective, this idea of bringing the farmers to the table so that they can be actors and advocates for their own needs is something that I think we'll come back to as well. But let me just turn to Frank. I mean, obviously, Frank, we're both from Bayer. I mean, we have a certain degree of self-interest in the conversation around the sale of products to farmers. But can you build maybe on Ariana's perspective here and give us this view, perhaps? How can companies like us, like Bayer, like our competitors, how can they deliver to this complex need that a farmer has?
Yeah, thanks, Tom. And actually to both statements, I think, because I fully agree that we need to define farming and agriculture more as a system. And that's also, if I may share this here with you, also the journey we are on in our company, really transforming from a product-driven company to an innovation-driven company. And this is really critical because Bernd Olix, the farmer here in the first place, is not only a potato grower or a sugar beet grower or an oilseed rape grower, but he runs a farm, he runs a system, and you will see that all of these things and solutions are linked. And that's, I think, where we see the transformation of agriculture happening, and hopefully also providing solution to the perfect storm that we've seen on the panel earlier. So how can we produce more food, but at the same time lower the environmental impact that agriculture has on nature and biodiversity? And I think the answer is out here, where we see that we really need to look at the combination of products and solutions, and also learn together with farmers, and do also elements right and with science that maybe so far have been overlooked by certain players in the value chain. And I think these are some of the great examples that we see later on of how cover crops can help actually in the production, improve soil health, and at the same time lower the carbon emission of a farm. So innovation will be key, but it's all about connecting innovation, connecting products, and connecting approaches that will provide better solutions for the future.
Thank you, Frank. I'm going to pick up that idea of systems thinking and Yvonne, ask you to comment on that. I mean, obviously your organization thinking around sustainable food systems. But if you think about the system from a broader perspective, I mean, it involves all of the organizations that we represent today. It involves the farmer. It also potentially involves the end consumer, right? The people who kind of buy and take the product that comes from agricultural production. So what are your thoughts on the systemic thinking and the need for focus there?
Yes, thanks, Thomas. And it's a pleasure and a challenge to participate in this event here today with this inspiring scenario. I'm not an economist. I'm not a lawyer, I'm not a chemist, so this makes it easier to have a global vision of the food systems. I might add that my family has some farmlands in the Mediterranean area, an area where the impact of climate change on agriculture is increasingly evident and dramatic. And I'm very glad to, after listening all my colleagues this morning, that we are all on the same page. The title feels an opportunity, feeding the world, protecting the planet, is very timely. This is the challenge. The situation is very serious. And it is important, I think it is important to point out that the food energy that the the whole world population needs is produced from photosynthesis. I'm referring directly either, so as agriculture, or indirectly, I'm referring to energy that comes from grazing livestock, mushrooms, algae, deep sea fishing, honey, etc. The difficult moment that we are facing is an opportunity, a big opportunity to show society the importance of agriculture, giving it the visibility and recognition, the recognition it deserves. The agriculture is a sector. Yeah. I would say that is a key sector. And the food sector, I think that has to lead the change. We are talking about change, a huge change, I would say.
Yeah.
And,
may I interrupt you there, Yvonne? I mean,
yes.
we need to lead the change. The food sector, the agricultural sector need to lead the change. Do you see an important role for consumer in that in that process as well? Do they have an important role to play too, in addition to the actors?
Yeah. I have prepared some reflections here today because the challenge is huge, so I have some reflections. And maybe I can refer, as you say, the food system, we said this morning, is complex, is multivariate, and interrelated. That's a very important point. We define the food system in 4 interconnected axes. The first axis is availability and accessibility. I'm referring to climate change, soil, water, different resources, food industries, production. The second axis, I'm referring to economic. It's price, cost, macro, microeconomy. The third axis, I'm referring to legislation and regulations, human rights, etc. And the fourth axis, I'm referring more to the social aspects, behavior, culture, knowledge, gastronomy, religion, etc. And my point is that for the growth of humanity to be harmonious and sustainable within an ethical framework, for sure, all the 4 axes make up the food system have to evolve proportionally and in balance. And for this, the role of science and innovation is very important. The challenges we have only be resolved if they are approached as an holistic point of view of system, considering all its variables, and not just the economic or environmental ones. At this point, we can pose the question, do we have the planet or humanity? Because some approaches and considerations give the feeling that in order to find the balance of our food system with the planet is put first over the survival and basic needs of its citizens many times.
So let me interrupt you there if I can, Yvonne. I want to bring some of the other speakers in on that very idea. Why don't we pick up from that point? So Urs, maybe I can throw this one back to you. How do we kind of, you talked earlier on about the development in your own thinking about, for example, organic farming, this perspective that there needed to be a broader point of view on that in terms of the context of modern farming. Maybe you can expand on that for us a little bit, thinking about the context that we're in and some of the things that we've been talking about here that we see on the farm today.
Yeah, and both of my colleagues have spoken about we need a system approach, we need a holistic thinking, and I think that's still quite a new idea. And to apply a holistic approach, a system approach, we need a different kind of knowledge and different kind of skills. For instance, we still, and we will also in the future, need the tacit, the traditional knowledge of the farm community. We cannot underestimate that, because that enables farmers to adapt to their local situation, to contextualize all our theories. Without that, we cannot really farm in an appropriate way, site-specifically. And secondly, we need the tremendously grown knowledge on ecosystems. Looking back 60 years only, there was not a real understanding how ecosystems work, or how agroecosystems work. So this knowledge of the scientific community is urgently needed. And thirdly, we need innovation. So I cannot imagine to feed 8 billion people or 9 billion people without using the tremendous and fantastic ideas of our scientific community, also in terms of permanent innovation. And unfortunately, that's a little bit, I haven't been very happy that the organic community has a lot to offer, so much to offer, but is a little bit backwards looking. And many innovative ideas are rejected, banned, and also maybe because the way they apply the precautionary principle is extremely narrow. Not to risk anything is not a correct or a decent application of the precautionary principle. So we need to risk something, otherwise we cannot gain.
Yeah, and that sense of risking, the idea that there's no inherent contradiction, I think, is what you're saying, between a sustainable way of farming and using modern technologies, using innovation in order to help us get there. I mean, Frank, obviously from the perspective of a company like Bayer, we spend a significant amount of money every year on innovation and bringing innovation to the farmer. I mean, what is your perspective? How do you see that playing out for us?
No, fully agree with that. To start with the ecosystem approach, right, Urs, I think we need actually more information. We need to not only incorporate the knowledge of the scientific community, but also the knowledge that farmers have. I mean, Bernd knows from generation exactly what is going on in his farm. This is changing over time, but he has a lot of knowledge in his head. So making that knowledge available for him and also for others is another very important key, I think, for us. And what helps us now in this bringing together of ecosystem thinking and innovation are two technology revolutions that we also see right now. One is the digital transformation of agriculture, which helps us to capture that knowledge, to measure, to document, to really see what is happening on the field, and with that also to become much more specific. The second are advancements in biological life sciences. So new options for us to develop new breeding approaches and better seeds. Biological products that help us to reduce synthetic fertilizers. Biological products that help us also to fight pests and diseases. So by combining these approaches and using new technologies, combining that with the knowledge that the scientific community has, enabled by digital technology, that's where I and we, all of this coming together. And the good news is a lot of that is already there. So that transformation has already started, and innovative farmers really see this, and we will actually see some of that also here today.
Yeah. Thanks for that perspective, Frank, and maybe I can turn to you, Arianna, to build on that a little bit. I mean, obviously, again, we've talked about this idea of bringing the farmer very much front and center into the process, making them the actor, making them a critical part of the decisions that go into how we continue to evolve the farming system. I mean, maybe you can talk to us a little bit about the attractiveness of this shift. How is it that we make sure, we talked earlier on the previous panel about the idea of carrots and sticks. I mean, maybe not in those terms, but how do we continue to incentivize and make attractive this shift and transformation for the farmer?
Sure, thanks for the question, and thanks also for the amazing inputs, because basically what the farmers, through their organized voice, always say is that what we need is a farmer-centric, science-based approach to do what? To offer solutions, and I want to come back to this, solutions, pragmatic solutions that can be used. So what will make the farmer decide to shift? Let's be clear. A farmer is an economic actor, so they do love the land. The best capital they have, and it's a capital, is the land they have to deal with every day. But if this choice, the best possible ever, with the best scientific foundation, with the best technology available, but if this doesn't pay at the end of the day, and they cannot feed their children, they won't choose it. They can't. So what would be the driver is to make solutions innovative, but also viable, that are able to deliver an economic return on the investment that is necessary. Investment, Ramizo told us before, so who's paying for this? So we need to shift food systems. We need to regenerate. So who's paying for that? Is it the farmer only? So farmer-centric doesn't mean the farmers have to bear the cost of everything. It's a joint effort, and it's a joint effort throughout the value chain to find the solutions that are able to deliver value. Because I hope we're going to come back to this, but there's a real pain point here. If we don't rebalance power in the value chain, if we don't give value to the farmers, this is just a very nice fairy tale we're telling us. It's not the direction we're taking.
Thank you, Arianna. I can see you nodding along to that one. Or maybe another question that I was thinking of as you were talking in your previous contribution, you know, the idea of gaining a better understanding of this complexity. What is it, do you think, that we need to do in order to help people understand the complexity of agriculture? Is there a greater role for the companies to play, for the farmers themselves, for other organizations? How is it that we actually can kind of increase that understanding of their situation?
Yeah, in agroecological agriculture, we talk about co-creation of knowledge. Yeah. And we talk about peer-to-peer learning. Mm-hmm. And think about that. This is something completely new in the context of a Bayer press conference. This is absolutely new thinking, because in the past, the company has developed solution and has given the solution to the farmers. And we take care of all your problems. And this is not the new way. And we need to expand the idea of co-creation of knowledge to the consumer as well. We need to integrate the consumer as well into the development of the farm of the future, of the management of the future. I think that's very important. For instance, at the moment in Switzerland, we develop a huge project with 50 farms in the Italian, in the German, and in the French-speaking part of Switzerland. 50 pilot farms being in transformation towards a very high sustainability and a very high productivity. Also, organic are part of this development, and integrated pest management farms. So, because all the farms can further develop. And in addition to this group of 50 farmers, where they learn together with scientists and farm advisors, we also invite consumers from the region to participate, to look, to give advice to the farmers, to come up with ideas. Couldn't you try that one and that one? And also that the consumers learn what is feasible and what is not feasible on a farm. So maybe this is a little bit a Swiss style, because we have not so huge farms. And we are very close to consumers.
Yeah.
But this opportunity has to be taken, and maybe also in the United States or in Canada or in Germany, one can learn from such experiments.
Yeah, that's a great model, Urs, and a great inspiration. And indeed, I can see, Yvonne, you were nodding along to that, the idea of bringing the consumer closer. You see the relevance of that too?
That's key point. Let me refer to this consumer and few risks that I have some reflections on that. I will mention the false sense of risk. Let me say something. Present-day society, particularly in the more industrialized economies, assumes that the agriculture is capable of supplying more and better food to the entire population with little effort. For this reason, it has stopped valuing its activity. In a few years, it had gone from trust and full social recognition to questioning. That's fact. And we hear more allusions to the polluting effects of agriculture production, to the loss of biodiversity it produces, to the lack of food security, than to its critical role in supplying food. So I'm referring to a false sense of risk towards the environment and consumer health is transferred to public opinion, this false sense of risk, associated with the development of a new industrialized agriculture. In contrast to traditional or ecological one that without a deep analysis, they assume, in many cases erroneously, more suitable. Mm-hmm. That's one risk.
And I think what you're hinting at there a little bit is also information and how people form their opinions about the industry, and it's certainly something that we talk about a lot, right? The perception and the attitudes towards the industry that we operate in, Frank. To what extent do you think initiatives like this? I mean, Urs mentioned this is kind of quite a novel way of having a press conference from a Bayer perspective. To what extent do initiatives like this, partnerships, help us get into different kinds of conversations, and what is it that Bayer is really looking to achieve from those?
Yeah, as we said earlier, right, we definitely need to do more events on the farms rather than in meeting rooms. And I think the expectation that society rightfully has in terms of how food is produced and all the traceability of food, I think that's also where technology can help us. I mean, technology is not the answer to everything, but if you combine technologies, be it now in digital or in life sciences and seeds, with that holistic approach, then I think agriculture can play a very different role and also move a lot closer to food producers and ultimately the consumers. Yeah. So farmers like Bernd, who uses a digital platform already today, can document what they do on the farm. And he makes that also available to his customers. And I think here just by bringing that transparency about what products he uses, but also his whole approach on the farm, is actually helping to explain that many farmers around the globe understand themselves already today as stewards, because Bernd's wish is also to have the 7th and 8th generation taking over, and that connectivity in the value chain is definitely something which I believe we need to talk more about, and we need to talk together about, and that's, I think, a good start here today. And we definitely want to do more about that, and also need your help here to help us to communicate better to a broader public.
Absolutely. Speaking of which, do we have any questions in the room? Is there anyone that has a question for our panel? No questions in the room, but I do have questions on the chat here. We were talking about the ecosystem, we're talking about the multiple players in the conversation. How about the role of startups in co-creation of some of these solutions and the systemic thinking that we need to move towards? I mean, Frank, we have partnerships with a number of companies through our Leaps venture, for example, and beyond. Maybe you want to comment, and maybe Ariana, you also have a perspective from your point of view too.
Yeah, I can briefly start here. Of course, also our approach to innovation has completely changed over the past 10 years. Today, we also don't have the illusion that we can actually invent or research all by ourselves, but we are doing this really in a network of collaboration for all technology forms, be it now for our seeds and traits research, for our crop protection research, or digital. And I think that that ecosystem of partnership is really another future-oriented view. And in particular, also when I look at Europe, I want to mention one collaboration we have for wheat, since we will see this also later on, where we partner with another European seed company to develop new seed varieties that will boost the productivity of wheat. And that's one example of how also we have to collaborate and want to collaborate to produce better solutions for our customers. Yeah. Ariane?
Yeah, just to complement on the idea of startups. And first, we are desperately in need always of innovative idea, because farmers are innovators by nature and by necessity. And with this world around us, we do need innovation more and more moving forward. In particular, with regards to startup and the need for an ecosystem that is able to deliver this value, I would like to bring in another element of complexity. Farmers are fragmented. Mm-hmm. So not only we need innovation to come through the ecosystem as an option, as a solution, but we need to bring that solution to the farmers where they are. So there's another actor in this game that is necessary, and it's the farmers' organizations, the organized agricultural voice, because you will never reach the last farmer on the most remote rural area on your own, or even if you have the best available technology. You need farmers' organization to go the last mile between a nice idea and a successful implementation. So yes, ecosystem, and let's create the capacity among the farmers' community to express their voice properly and to bring innovation where they are. So we need innovation brokerage, if we can call it like this. We need innovation capacity building somehow, and exposure to innovation.
Thank you, Ariana. I mean, maybe Urs, you can bring in a perspective here as well. I'm going to play on your Swiss heritage a little bit. I mean, well known as one of the most innovative companies in the world. I mean, do you see things that are happening either in other sectors or indeed in our sector that gives you cause for hope that there will be more innovation, more partnership with also smaller companies in this space?
Yeah, I have never seen so many startup companies coming up around food, around eating, around consumption, and around farming. And this is only very positive, because each of them represents an idea. Mm-hmm. And it was already mentioned this morning, we need so many ideas to solve the problem, to tackle the challenge. And that's fantastic. That's a fantastic development. And I'm so happy that not only agronomists like we are, or maybe we are, but also all kind of scientists have become, and all kind of people have become interested in developing something new, in realizing a new idea. That's great.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to pick up on something that you said earlier, Frank, if I can. This was a question also raised in the chat, that you had mentioned that a lot of the ag innovations that we need in order to drive towards this more sustainable future are innovations that already exist in many ways, but there are certain obstacles perhaps to them being able to be scaled rapidly or deployed where they are most needed. So maybe you can kind of talk through a little bit what you had in mind when you shared that.
Yeah, and I want to bring it a little bit closer to Europe, since we are here in the heart of Europe, since I really believe that Europe, the European Commission, the member states really need to play a significant role also in that sustainable transformation of agriculture, and to address the challenges we talked about in the earlier panel, food security, the decarbonization of agriculture, and lowering the environmental impact of agriculture. And there are a number of technologies, also future technologies, where I would urge also politicians and the European Commission to just weave that framework that we as an industry and as partners in this industry need to deliver the solutions of the future. We need still product innovation. We need more and not less product innovation. And Europe has one of the best soils in the world. Bernd actually has one of the best soils here in the world to produce his crops. Europe in general has the best soil to produce wheat. And I think we also have, if I may speak also as a European here, we have that responsibility also to contribute. And that's where I definitely think we need to step up together to explain this, and then I think we can also significantly help the world to address these challenges.
Fantastic. Thanks very much indeed for that perspective. Frank, Yvonne, you're nodding. You want to jump in on that
Yes.
idea of partnership? Yeah.
Yeah. So many ideas came to my head after listening also. I will try to do kind of a resume. What I want to say is just a few things. For example, just for reflection. In a short time, we have gone from a slow analogical system to fast digital ones. That's one, I would say that's one important reflection. Because after maybe we can talk about the fake news or disinformation that is coming all together. I would like to say that opinions are not important in science. It's the facts, the data, that really matter.
Yeah.
And pseudoscience is based on opinions or emotions that are disseminated without being rigorously evaluated. And that hurts. That hurts a lot.
Yeah. That reminds me a little bit of what Ariana was saying earlier on about the need for a farmer-centric, fact-based, science-based approach, right? I mean, I think we need to continue to be, on the empirical side, but acknowledge that a lot of our stakeholders in the audience have different perspectives indeed. So I'm just one eye on the time. We have just a few minutes left really with this panel, but I want to also ask you all to help me kind of close here with some thoughts and reflections. I mean, obviously we've been talking about this transition towards sustainable agriculture. We've been talking about the journey that we're on and what we need in order to be able to progress on that journey. Maybe I could ask each of you to reflect a little bit on what you think is the most important, innovation and/or action that we need in order to to accelerate this transformation towards sustainable agriculture. And Ariana, I'm looking at you, so I'm going to start with you. You get the unlucky role of kicking us off, but also you get the first chance to bring us your ideas.
I'm happy to go first, actually, to add some additional complexity to our conclusions. We've been talking a lot about data. So what do we need? For sure, we need a lot of data here. And I heard somewhere that in this digital new world, data for agriculture will be as a new crop. Let me remind you what happened with the value for farmers with crops. So I want to conclude by launch another challenge on how do we ensure that data are bringing value to the farmers as well, and not only to other actors in the value chain, because that's where things can make the difference between simply sharing or being part of the solution and contributing to build insights that are meaningful and drive change. So that would be my take to conclude.
Thank you very much indeed for the contribution. Urs, I'll turn to you next.
Yeah, I had been very impressed by the farm of Tompkins in Argentina, where he practiced on 3,000 hectares contour and strip farming using all the digitalization technology, including precision farming. And what I see here is far from that. So I think it's really important that the innovation of the 21st century, like digitalization, like nanotechnology and like biotechnology, we use for the best application of sustainable farming system. We shouldn't use them to simplify, to even more simplify our farming system. We should use these technologies to diversify farming systems and so that really we have a sustainable landscape, and that's for me very important. We shouldn't make the same mistakes that technological progress is always used for simplification. It should be the other way around.
Great, thank you for that perspective, Urs. Appreciate it. And Yvonne, turning to you for some closing thoughts.
Can you say 3 little points?
3 little points.
Summarize all together. So we should avoid a double food system in the world. That means, on the one hand, citizens who can afford a certain type of diet, for example, organics with more expensive products, not necessarily safer or more nutrition, and other citizens who cannot afford this type of food. I really agree with what my colleague said. Also, very important, a lot to do on education. It was mentioned this morning. Adequate communication, proper information, and repression of fake news and misinformation, as well as to sensitize of the entire population. That's crucial. The whole population must be concerned about the serious challenges we are facing. And I think we have some very important representatives of the media here today. Your role is fundamental. And my last point, I will mention about the food system. We will reach the balance if we are referring to the 4 axes. And also, why not? I will do a recommendation about reading this report. It's doing by Triptolemos Foundation, by the way. I recommend reading, the title is Report on the Impact of European Green Deal from a Sustainable Global Food System Approach. And that's in which 30 researchers from different disciplines have participated. And in the words of our Minister of Agriculture, he says, the systemic approach provided by the Triptolemos Foundation is essential and covers serene and informed debates and work. Very useful to build sustainable food systems.
Thank you. No, thank you, Yvonne, and thank you for your contribution to also an informed and hopefully very entertaining debate this morning. And Frank, I'll move to you for your closing thoughts as well.
Yeah, thanks, Tom. Product innovation is important, but ecosystem innovation is even more important. No? And within our company, we call that tailored solutions. So really think about how we, and as an industry, also broader, can deliver solutions to farmers that contain the traditional aspects like yield or quality promises, but each solution nowadays already also needs to have very strong sustainability value propositions for the food chain, but also for farmers. Ultimately, farmers also need to have an economic reason to apply. And maybe my concluding remarks are there are many, many challenges, as we've heard, but a lot of that is already available. A lot of that you will see now within the next 2 hours. So I think we can move quickly if we really bring everyone together in the industry.
Okay, thank you very much indeed, Frank. Thanks, Yvonne. Thanks, Urs. Thanks, Ariana, for being part of our second panel today. Really appreciate your time.
Thank you.
So that's all that we have time for, and thank you all also for your participation here on the ground in Romiskirchen, and of course to everybody that joined us online as well. Thanks for participating, thanks for your questions. I hope we got through as many of them as we could. We appreciated those, and appreciated the chance for this approach to dialogue, and hope that we can do it again with you in the future on other topics as well. So thanks to our online participants.